When the federal marshals entered the assembly floor with a signed seizure order, Ryan Caldwell went pale. He screamed at me to turn the presses back on. I just smiled, sipped my coffee, and said, "Call my IP lawyer. Your license expired at midnight." But to understand how we got there, we have to go back 15 years. I'm 55 years old. If you spend 30 years in precision manufacturing, you learn to read the rhythm of a factory floor by sound alone. You can hear a hydraulic line losing pressure from 3 bays away. You can hear when a carbide punch is dulling just by the pitch of the impact against high-tensile steel. For 15 of those years, I was the head of precision tooling at Caldwell Precision Stamping. We were a mid-sized shop in Michigan, but we punched far above our weight class. We had one primary lifeblood: a contract to manufacture critical structural engine brackets for Detroit Auto Group. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was highly technical. We were working with tolerances of plus or minus 0.02 millimeters. In our world, that's not just a number. That's the difference between a car engine sitting securely in its bay or tearing itself apart at 60 miles an hour. The founder of the company, Richard Caldwell, understood this. Richard was a self-made machinist who started the business in a rented garage with a single manual mill. He built the company on sweat and absolute quality. When I came on board 15 years ago, we were struggling with tool wear. When you run an 800-ton hydraulic press at 40 strokes a minute, the friction generates immense thermal energy. The steel stamping dies expand. As they expand, the dimensions of the parts drift. Back then, we had to shut down the line every 2 hours to let the tooling cool down and manually recalibrate the guide pins. It was costing us thousands of dollars a day in downtime and scrap metal. I spent 3 years of my own time, working late nights in my home garage, solving that problem. I developed a high-speed progressive stamping die system with an integrated thermal expansion compensation mechanism. In plain terms, I built a system where the die itself could adjust its internal dimensions dynamically in real time, using microsensors and a proprietary software feedback loop. I didn't design this on company time, and I didn't use company resources. I patented it under my own name. It became U.S. patent number 9876543. When Richard saw the prototype in action, he knew it was a game changer. Our downtime dropped to 0. Our scrap rate fell below 0.1%. Richard was an honest man, so we sat down with our lawyers and drew up a licensing agreement. I didn't want to sell the patent outright. I wanted to protect my intellectual property. So, we established a separate legal entity, Vance Tooling Tech LLC. My LLC leased the patent rights to Caldwell Precision Stamping. The terms were simple. They paid me my regular salary as head of tooling, plus a monthly licensing fee for the software and patent usage. Crucially, my lawyer insisted on Clause 12D. It was a standard protect your backside clause. It stated that the license was tied to my active employment. If I was ever terminated without cause, or if the company attempted to bypass my LLC, the patent license would terminate automatically within 10 business days unless the company paid a flat buyout fee of $1.5 million. If they failed to pay and continued to use the dies to manufacture parts, the contract specified that they were operating without a license, exposing them to treble damages for willful infringement under federal law. Richard signed it without hesitation. He told me he never planned on letting me go anyway. For 12 years, that contract sat in a filing cabinet, gathering dust while we made money. We became Detroit Auto Group's exclusive supplier for those brackets. We were shipping 80,000 units a month. Richard bought a home in Florida, spent less time at the plant, and eventually, the day came that every old-school manufacturing guy dreads. Richard retired from daily operations and handed the keys of the company to his son. Ryan was 31 years old. He had a brand new MBA from an expensive school, a collection of tailored suits that looked ridiculously out of place on a greasy factory floor, and a desperate need to prove he was smarter than his father. The first time he walked through my shop, he didn't look at the machines. He looked at the spreadsheets. He saw my salary, and then he saw the monthly licensing line item paid to Vance Tooling Tech LLC. To a guy like Ryan, a veteran engineer isn't an asset. We're just a massive liability on the balance sheet. He couldn't comprehend that the only reason those 800-ton presses weren't producing expensive scrap metal was because of the code running on my private server. He just saw a 55-year-old guy making too much money. Within his first month, Ryan hired a junior engineer fresh out of state college. A kid named Tyler who could talk about lean manufacturing and Six Sigma, but had never actually changed a die in his life. Ryan started inviting Tyler to our production meetings, having him shadow me and asking him if he could replicate my tooling designs. I watched it happen with a quiet amusement. I've seen dozens of Ryans come and go in my career. They always think the magic is in the steel, not the brain that shaped it. Then, the corporate greed finally manifested. It was a Tuesday morning when I got a calendar invite for a private meeting in the executive conference room. Just Ryan, Tyler, and a representative from Human Resources. When I walked in, there was a stack of papers in the middle of the mahogany table. Ryan didn't even ask me to sit down. He just leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and got straight to the point. "Marcus," Ryan said, tapping his pen on the stack of papers. "We're streamlining operations. I've been reviewing our vendor agreements, and this licensing fee to Advanced Tooling Tech LLCs is a redundant expense. It's costing us $90,000 a year for technology that's running inside our own plant, on our own machines." I've had Tyler here review the design, and he agrees it's basic PLC code and mechanical adjustments. So, we've drafted a patent assignment agreement. You're going to sign over U.S. patent number 9876543 to Caldwell Precision Stamping for $0. Since you developed it while working here, it's legally company property under the work-for-hire doctrine anyway. We're just cleaning up the paperwork. I looked at the kid Tyler, who was busy staring at his shoes, then back at Ryan. I didn't get angry. When you spend decades handling heavy machinery, you learn that losing your temper is how people lose fingers. You stay calm and you assess the load. "Ryan," I said, my voice flat, "your father and I spent 3 months negotiating that contract with our attorneys. The patent was filed and granted 2 years, before I ever signed an employment contract with Caldwell Precision. It is not work for hire. It is private property owned by Advanced Tooling Tech LLC. The monthly licensing fee is what keeps those high-speed progressive dies running at 40 strokes a minute. Without it, you don't have a business." Ryan laughed, a short, condescending bark. "Marcus, you've been here too long. You think you're indispensable. The technology is in our machines. The dies are steel, and they belong to us. We paid for the fabrication. Tyler has already backed up the CAD drawings. We don't need your LLC anymore." He pushed the papers across the table and handed me a pen. "Sign the assignment. If you sign it, we'll let you keep your job until the end of the year to transition your responsibilities to Tyler. If you don't, we're terminating you immediately. For cause, meaning you forfeit your severance package, and we will cancel your $150,000 in unvested performance shares. The choice is yours." I looked down at the pen. It was a cheap plastic click pen with the Caldwell logo printed on the side. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ryan wanted to play corporate hardball, but he didn't even understand the rules of the game he was playing. He thought he was holding all the cards because he had the HR rep in the room and the power to cut off my badge. He didn't realize he was standing on a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. "I won't sign it," I said quietly. Ryan's face tightened. He wasn't expecting me to walk away so easily from $150,000 in stock. He thought the threat of financial ruin would break a 55-year-old guy with a mortgage. But what he didn't know was that my house was paid off, my kids were through college, and I had been preparing for a day like this ever since Richard announced his retirement. "Fine," Ryan snapped. He nodded to the HR representative. "Marcus Vance is terminated, effective immediately. Tyler, go grab the security guard. Marcus, you have 20 minutes to pack your personal belongings. You are not to touch any company computers, and you are not to download any files. Security will escort you to your vehicle." "No need to get security, Ryan," I said, standing up. "I can find my own way out. I've walked these floors for 15 years. I walked out of the conference room and down to the tooling bay. The plant floor was loud. The steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the 800-ton press in Bay 4 vibrating through the concrete floor. That press was currently running our custom progressive die, stamping out engine brackets for Detroit Auto Group. I stood there for a moment, listening to the machine. It sounded perfect. The microsensors in the die were communicating with my server, adjusting the hydraulic cylinders by microns to compensate for the heat of the friction. Tyler arrived a minute later with a burly security guard who looked embarrassed to be there. I didn't make a scene. I went to my workbench, opened my heavy red toolbox, and began packing my tools. My dial indicators, my micrometer sets, my custom ground carbide scribes. These weren't company tools. They were my personal instruments, accumulated over a lifetime of trade. "Marcus," Tyler whispered, looking nervous. "I'm sorry about this. Ryan just wants to move the company forward." "Don't worry about it, kid," I said, wrapping my precision level in an oiled rag. "Just remember to watch the heat on Bay 4. The high tensile steel we're running today has a lot of spring back. If you don't calibrate it, the tolerances will drift." "I've got the CAD files," Tyler said, trying to sound confident. "I'll just adjust the press stroke manually if the parts go out of spec." I almost smiled. Adjusting the press stroke manually on a progressive die running at 40 strokes a minute is like trying to adjust a watch with a hammer. But I didn't correct him. It wasn't my job to teach him anymore. I closed the lid of my toolbox, locked it, and lifted it onto the handcart. The security guard wheeled it out to my truck. As I drove out of the parking lot, I checked my watch. It was 10:15 in the morning. I pulled over at a diner down the street, ordered a black coffee and a plate of eggs, and called my intellectual property attorney, Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "they just fired me, and Ryan Caldwell told me they aren't paying the patent license anymore." On the other end of the line, I heard the sound of paper rustling. "Did they pay the buyout fee?" she asked. "No. Ryan claims it's work for hire and they own it anyway." I could hear the smile in Sarah's voice. "Excellent, I'll draft the formal notice. We'll give them the contractually mandated 10 business days. After that, we pull the plug." "Sounds like a plan," I said. I hung up the phone and took a sip of my coffee. For the first time in 15 years, I had nothing to do on a Tuesday afternoon. The next 10 days were surprisingly peaceful. I worked on my yard, clean-polished my old Harley in the garage, and did some consulting work for a machine shop over in Grand Rapids. I didn't check my former work email, and I didn't call anyone at the plant. But behind the scenes, the legal machinery was grinding. On the afternoon of my termination, Sarah sent a certified letter to Caldwell Precision Stamping. It was a formal notice of contract violation, citing Clause 12D. It stated in plain, unambiguous legal English that due to my termination without cause, the patent licensing agreement between Vance Tooling Tech LLC and Caldwell Precision Stamping would terminate in exactly 10 business days unless the company paid the buyout fee of $1.5 million. Ryan, of course, ignored it. According to an old buddy of mine who still worked in the shipping bay, Ryan laughed when he received the letter and threw it in his desk drawer. He was convinced that my patent was a bluff and that they could run the dies indefinitely. He even stopped the automatic accounts payable system from paying my monthly licensing invoice, which was due on the 10th. That was his second major mistake. The software that controlled the progressive stamping dies wasn't installed locally on the factory floor computers. That was one of the security measures I had insisted on when we built the system. The physical press ran on a basic PLC that controlled the hydraulics and feed mechanism. But the proprietary algorithm that calculated the thermal expansion and adjusted the stamping tolerances in real time was hosted on a secure AWS cloud server owned by my LLC. Every 10,000 cycles, the local PLC was programmed to ping my server, verify the active licensing token, and download a new set of calibration offsets based on the temperature sensors embedded in the carbide die inserts. If the PLC didn't receive a fresh token within a set grace period, it assumed the connection was compromised or the license had expired. When that happened, the PLC would automatically fall back to its default factory settings. The default settings were designed as a safety measure. They locked the dies in their cold state, disabling the dynamic adjustments. It was a failsafe to prevent the expensive tooling from cracking under uneven heat distribution. The press would still run. The metal would still be stamped, but the thermal compensation system would shut down completely. I didn't have to hack into their network. I didn't have to write a single line of malicious code. I simply let the calendar do the work. On the 10th business day, at precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the monthly billing cycle for the licensing token expired. Since Caldwell's accounts payable had marked my LLC's invoice as disputed and unpaid, the server's automated script did what it was programmed to do. It revoked the token. The next morning at 8:30, Sarah sent out the second round of letters. This time, she didn't just write to Caldwell Precision. She sent a certified letter directly to the legal department at Detroit Auto Group. The letter was a masterpiece of cold, professional warning. It stated that Caldwell Precision Stamping was currently manufacturing structural engine brackets using unlicensed technology protected by U.S. Patent number 9876543. Under United States patent law, specifically Title 35, Section 271, anyone who imports, sells, or uses an infringing product is liable for patent infringement. In other words, by buying those brackets from Caldwell, Detroit Auto Group was legally exposing themselves to secondary patent infringement. We attached a copy of my patent, a copy of the expired licensing agreement, and a copy of the cease and desist order we had sent to Caldwell. If you want to get the attention of a multi-billion-dollar automotive manufacturer, you don't call their purchasing department, you call their lawyers. Detroit Auto Group had thousands of vehicles rolling off assembly lines every day. The last thing they wanted was a federal judge issuing an injunction that could freeze their entire inventory or tie them up in a massive patent lawsuit over a bracket. I was sitting on my back porch, drinking a cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was a Detroit area code. I didn't answer it. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, it rang again. This time it was Ryan Caldwell's cell phone. I let that one go to voicemail too. Then came the text messages. First from Ryan. Marcus, call me immediately. The server link is down. We have a production emergency. 5 minutes later, Marcus, this is illegal. You're violating your employment covenants. Turn the server back on, or our lawyers will sue you for everything you have. I read the texts, smiled, and deleted them. I had spent 15 years building that company's reputation, ensuring every single bracket that left our docks was flawless. I had given them my expertise, my labor, and my patience. Ryan thought he could throw me away like a worn-out drill bit and steal my life's work. He was about to learn that in the modern industrial world, the pen and the patent are far heavier than the 800-ton press. By Thursday morning, the situation at the plant had devolved into absolute chaos. I knew this because Dave, my former lead setup technician, called me during his 15-minute break. Marcus, Dave said, his voice hushed and strained over the static. It's a madhouse here. The server shut off yesterday morning, just like you said. The thermal compensation on Bay 4 stopped working. Within 3 hours, the tooling heated up to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The dies expanded, and the tolerances went completely out of spec. We're pulling parts that are 0.15 millimeters off the nominal dimension. They look like bananas. What did Tyler do? I asked, leaning back in my armchair. He panicked, Dave said, letting out a bitter laugh. Ryan was standing over his shoulder, screaming that we had to ship 40,000 brackets by Friday or Detroit Auto Group would pull our vendor status. Tyler tried to adjust the hydraulic press stroke manually to compensate. He adjusted the shut height by 0.1 millimeters. All that did was crush the guide pins and gall the carbide punches. Now the die is scoring the metal, but Ryan made us pack them and ship them anyway. They loaded 2 flatbeds this morning. I shook my head. They ship parts with a 0.15 millimeter variance for engine mounts? Yep, Ryan said. Detroit Auto Group's automated assembly line wouldn't notice a tenth of a millimeter. He called it acceptable manufacturing drift. I thanked Dave for the heads up and hung up. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Detroit Auto Group's robotic assembly arms don't negotiate. They are programmed to pick up a bracket, place it on the engine block, and drive 4 bolts through the pre-drilled holes using automated pneumatic torque wrenches. If the bolt holes are misaligned by even 0.05 millimeters, the robotic arm will fail to seat the bolt, register an error, and shut down the entire conveyor line. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the shipping trucks arrived at Detroit Auto Group's assembly plant in Warren, Michigan. At 3:30, the first brackets were loaded onto the assembly line. By 4 o'clock, the line had shut down twice. The robotic sensors registered that the brackets were too narrow to fit the engine block mounts. The mounting holes were out of tolerance. The metal was scored from the damaged carbide punches, which meant the brackets had microfractures that compromised their structural integrity. Detroit Auto Group's VP of Supply Chain, Emily Ross, didn't waste time. She was a no-nonsense executive who had worked her way up through the automotive ranks. She immediately ordered the entire shipment quarantined, halted all incoming deliveries from Caldwell Stamping, and called their legal department. When their lawyers looked at the cease and desist letter Sarah had sent them the day before, they realized they were using unlicensed, defective parts that could result in structural engine failures and massive recalls. They immediately issued a formal notice to Caldwell. All contracts were frozen, all pending payments were suspended, and they were holding Caldwell liable for the millions of dollars in downtime caused by the assembly line stoppage. My phone rang at 4:45. It was Ryan Caldwell. This time I picked up Marcus. Ryan screamed into the receiver. His voice was cracked, his usual smug composure completely shattered. I could hear the roar of the factory floor in the background. What the hell did you do to our server? You locked us out. We just got a notice from Detroit Auto Group. They're freezing our accounts. They're threatening to sue us for $5 million. You turned off the software. I didn't turn anything off, Ryan, I said, keeping my voice quiet and steady. The billing cycle expired. Your accounts payable department refused to pay my LLC's monthly invoice, which is a breach of licensing contract. According to Clause 12D, which you chose not to review, my server automatically revokes the license token if the payment is more than 5 days overdue. Your system fell back to its default state. I told Tyler to watch the heat. Did he not do that? Tyler is an idiot, Ryan yelled. He ruined the guide pins. You did this on purpose. You're sabotaging this company. I'm calling the police. I'm going to have you arrested for hacking our systems. Go ahead and call them, Ryan, I said. The physical machines are yours. The code on my private server, which is located in a secure facility owned by Vance Tooling Tech LLC, is mine. I have every right to refuse service to a non-paying customer. You terminated my employment, you withheld my severance, and you refused to buy out the patent license as contractually agreed. You chose to run the dies without a license. That is a federal patent violation, and your primary client is now aware of it. If you want to discuss this further, I suggest you have your corporate counsel contact Sarah Jenkins. Don't call this number again. I hung up before he could respond. I sat there in the quiet of my living room, listening to the birds outside. For years, I had tolerated the corporate politics, the constant pressure to cut corners, and finally, the arrogance of a young heir who thought his degree made him a king. They thought they could strip away my security and take my invention for nothing. Now they were staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from a Detroit giant. Their assembly line was producing scrap metal, and their biggest client was ready to walk away forever. The weight of their choices was about to crush them, and I didn't have to lift a single finger. By Friday morning, the disaster was complete. Detroit Auto Group had formally notified Caldwell Precision Stamping that they were preparing to terminate their $20 million supply contract within 48 hours, unless they received written proof of patent clearance and a certified quality recovery plan. The threat of bankruptcy was a powerful wake-up call. It was enough to drag Richard Caldwell out of his retirement home in Naples, Florida, and put him on the first flight back to Michigan. According to Dave, Richard arrived at the plant at 7 o'clock that morning. He didn't even go to the executive offices. He walked straight onto the shop floor, saw the crushed guide pins and galled carbide inserts on the Bay 4 press, and immediately understood the magnitude of the disaster. He walked up to his son, Ryan, who was in the middle of arguing with a production supervisor, and fired him in front of the entire assembly team. He ordered Ryan to pack his office, turn in his keys, and leave the property. At 9:30, my attorney, Sarah, received a call from Richard's personal cell phone. He didn't want to use the company's corporate lawyers. He wanted a direct line to me. We scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon at 3 o'clock at Sarah's office in downtown Detroit. When Richard walked into the conference room, he looked older than 68. He was wearing his old greasy work jacket over a button-down shirt. He walked up to me, extended his hand, and sighed. "Marcus," he said, his voice quiet, "I am deeply sorry. Ryan is young, stupid, and greedy. He thought he could run a business on spreadsheets. He didn't understand that the value of this company isn't in the bricks or the steel. It's in the people who know how to make them work. I've removed him from operations. He has no authority here anymore." "I appreciate that, Richard," I said, shaking his hand. "I've always respected you. But Ryan breached our licensing agreement, withheld my severance, and tried to steal my patent. That's not just a family dispute. That's a legal matter." "I know," Richard said, sitting down. "And Detroit Auto Group is ready to bury us. We need the patent license restored today. We need the Bay 4 dies rebuilt, and we need the calibration server back online. Tell me what it takes to make this right." Sarah stepped forward and laid out our terms. We had spent the morning drafting them, and they were non-negotiable. First, Caldwell Stamping would buy out U.S. patent number 9876543. The original contract had a buyout fee of $1.5 million. But because they breached the contract and ran the dies without a license, we were charging a premium. The new buyout price was $2.5 million, payable within 5 business days. Second, the company would pay my outstanding $150,000 in restricted stock units, fully vested immediately, plus 6 months of severance pay that Ryan had withheld. Third, I would not return as an employee. Instead, my LLC, Vance Tooling Tech, would be retained as an independent consulting firm. I would supervise the rebuilding of the stamping dies and the restoration of the calibration server. My consulting rate would be $500 an hour, with a guaranteed minimum of 20 hours per week, contracted for a minimum of 1 year. Finally, Ryan was to have no association with the company's operations, and a written covenant was required stating that he was barred from entering the manufacturing facility. Richard listened to the terms. He didn't argue. He didn't try to negotiate. He knew he didn't have any leverage. The survival of his life's work was worth far more than the cost of our demands. "Agreed," Richard said. He looked at his corporate attorney, who was sitting next to him, and nodded. "Draft the paperwork. We'll sign it now." It took 3 hours for the attorneys to finalize the settlement and sign the documents. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wire transfer for the severance and the stock valuation had cleared my account. On Monday morning, I walked back onto the factory floor of Caldwell Precision Stamping. I wasn't wearing an employee badge anymore. I wore a visitor's pass with independent consultant printed in bold letters. The factory was quiet. The 800-ton press in Bay 4 was shut down, its heavy steel doors open. Tyler was standing nearby, looking exhausted and terrified. I didn't say anything to him. I put on my safety glasses, opened my laptop, and connected to the local PLC. I opened the security portal on my private server and reactivated the licensing token. Then, I spent the next 4 hours working with Dave and the maintenance crew, replacing the crushed guide pins and installing a new set of carbide punch inserts that I had ordered from our supplier. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we were ready. I stood back and gave the nod to Dave. He hit the start button. The press roared to life. The massive hydraulic ram came down with a heavy, deafening thump. The metal fed smoothly through the progressive stages. On my laptop screen, the microsensors in the die registered the rising temperature and communicated with my server. The algorithms calculated the thermal expansion, adjusted the hydraulic cylinder pressures by microns, and kept the tolerances perfect. I picked up the first bracket that rolled off the conveyor belt. I measured it with my micrometer. 0.01 millimeters off nominal, well within the plus or minus 0.02 tolerance limit. Dave took the bracket, measured it himself, and grinned. "Perfect, Marcus." I looked up at the executive offices overlooking the floor. The blinds in the COO's office were drawn. Ryan was gone. In his place, Richard was standing at the window, watching the machines run. He caught my eye and gave me a respectful nod. I nodded back, took a sip of my coffee, and packed my laptop into my bag. My consulting hours for the day were done. At $500 an hour, it had been a very productive morning.